Hi, this is Dr. Lyn Patrick here. I have been in so many discussions about this article in the last couple of weeks that I thought I'd do a short little explanation of what this report means and the backstory about lead and cadmium in chocolate. So, 2 weeks ago, December 15th, Consumer Reports released their it wasn't a study because it was not published, but their in-house report on lead and cadmium in dark chocolate. What they did is they tested 28 dark chocolate bars, both organic and conventionally produced, otherwise known as non-organic, and looked at the amount of lead and cadmium in them. Now, they determined the risk posed by the levels of lead and cadmium based on California's measurements that are used to determine violations of the Prop 65 regulation, which I have to talk about so you'll understand what this all means, but what is called the maximum allowable dose level for both lead and cadmium. Now, Proposition 65 is pretty complex, and I'll need to go into that in a moment. But before I do, just know that this is how Consumer Reports measured whether there was allowable levels, they called it low levels, or violation of Prop 65 levels, which they called high levels of both cadmium and lead. So let's dive into this before I go into the good, the bad, and the ugly dark chocolate bars. So Prop 65, as we'll see, was actually a proposition on the ballot that passed in California in the 1980s and was originally designed to prevent contamination of bodies of water in California. Now it applies to any consumer product that is manufactured in or sold in the state of California. So here's how it weighs out, so to speak, in terms of contamination. So Prop 65 contamination limits are based on a daily serving for a supplement, what the manufacturer suggests for how much you should take of that supplement every day. So if there is more than half of a microgram of lead in that daily serving, that's a violation of Prop 65. We do have regulations for levels of lead in food according to the Food and Drug Administration and the Environmental Protection Agency, and that's at a much higher limit. That's 8.8 micrograms per day for adults and 2.2 micrograms per day for children. Now, those are proposed levels, but they are probably going to be utilized fairly soon. I'll talk about that in a little bit. As far as water goes, the Environmental Protection Agency actually limits lead in water, as we all know, as a result of Flint, Michigan, to less than 15 micrograms per liter of drinking water. Now, cadmium, the other metal that was measured in chocolate, and there's a very specific reason why Consumer Reports picked both lead and cadmium, because they are known contaminants in chocolate. The Proposition 65 limit for cadmium is that it can't be any more than 4.1 micrograms per day. And again, the way that Consumer Reports computed this is they looked at how many micrograms of lead and how many micrograms of cadmium were in an ounce of chocolate. So that's what we're going to be talking about. Prop 65 was originally the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986. It was originally intended to regulate water contaminants and now is regulating over 900 chemicals that have been identified as carcinogens, reproductive toxicants, basically that have some known toxicity. The reason that supplement manufacturers are often really pissed off at the state of California and Prop 65 is that they were extremely conservative. The scientists that put together these levels looked at what is called a no observable effect level, or NOEL, N-O-E-L, for a particular chemical. And that's determined by animal studies. So how much of that chemical will cause either cancer or reproductive harm or birth defects in an animal. And then they looked at 1/1000th of that level. Okay, so that's why the levels for arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury, the four metals that Prop 65 specifically identifies, are much lower than some of the other regulatory agencies in the United States. So these two categories of toxicity, the no significant risk level, which looks at carcinogenicity, so how much of that chemical will cause cancer in an animal model, and maximum allowable dose levels, that's different. That's category number 2, for chemicals that cause reproductive toxicity. And this is the level that the Consumer Reports is looking at, as these maximum allowable dose levels, because they're looking at 1/1000th of the amount to provide an additional margin of safety. Okay, so what did Consumer Reports find? They found levels of cadmium in dark chocolate that were 253%, otherwise known as 2.5 times the Prop 65 limit. So for cadmium, that's, the Prop 65 limit is 1.4 micrograms in a daily serving. So they found as much as 3.5 micrograms per ounce of chocolate. So just remember that, 3.5 micrograms, upper limit for cadmium. For lead, they found 265 times the Prop 65 limit. That's also known as 2.5 times. So 2.5 times, that half a microgram is 1.33 micrograms per ounce. So you can remember 3.5 micrograms of cadmium per ounce and 1.33 micrograms per ounce. So how does that really figure in terms of how much chocolate we eat? Well, the average daily chocolate consumption in the U.S., we dwarf Switzerland and some other countries in the EU, is we eat less than 10 pounds a year. That comes out to about 0.4, about a half an ounce a day. So that's a good metric that they picked. We'll use that 1 ounce daily. I know some of you are thinking that you couldn't eat an ounce of chocolate. You couldn't limit yourself to an ounce of chocolate if your life depended on it. But, that's balanced out over 365 days. So we'll use that metric of 1 ounce as an approximation, a liberal way of measuring the metal content of chocolate as it relates to what a daily serving is, right? Because that's how Prop 65 is measured, is, how much of this contaminant or pollutant are you going to be eating as per a daily serving? Let's talk about cadmium first. Cadmium is a problem in our food supply because of how we grow food. I'll talk about that in a second. What you need to know about cadmium is that if it's in the air, it's very easily absorbed. It's very effectively absorbed through the respiratory tract, up to 50%. In the gut, not so much. Generally, about 5% of the cadmium that we eat makes it into our bodies, but it is absolutely individual. And it depends on a protein called the divalent metal transporter 1 protein, which transports a lot of different minerals into the bloodstream from the gut, including iron, including zinc, including copper, and including cobalt and lead. So some metals that can be toxicants, nickel as well. the less iron and zinc you have in your diet, the more cadmium will actually be transported across the gut barrier by this divalent metal transporter. And there are a lot of studies that have been published in Sweden and in Denmark that look at women who have low serum ferritin levels, who have low iron in their diet, and they have higher blood cadmium levels than women whose serum ferritin is normal. And in this study, they looked at 12 microgram per liter as the cutoff for serum ferritin. But the bottom line here is that if you are malnourished, you're not getting enough iron, especially if you're a female, you're not getting enough iron, you're not getting enough zinc, you are at risk for absorbing more cadmium from either food or other ways that, drinking water, that cadmium can get into your intestinal tract. In the United States, there is a risk level for cadmium, and that starts at about 7 micrograms per day for an average adult. So that's a tenth of a microgram per kilogram body weight per day, so 70 kilogram. Human adult, about 7 micrograms, much less for children. That's important. We remember I was talking about the high levels of cadmium are around 3.5 micrograms, 2.5 micrograms. So that is lower than the federal minimum risk level for cadmium, but we get cadmium from a lot of other places in our diet. In Sweden, where they've done most of the research on cadmium, dietary cadmium from Swedish diets can be as high as 175 micrograms per day, a huge intake of cadmium from contamination in foodstuffs. The World Health Organization has actually looked at areas with urban areas with high levels of pollution and found that individuals may be exposed to as much as or over 200 micrograms a day. So huge amounts of cadmium. That's definitely toxicity. If you look in the United States at the total diet study, that's what the Food and Drug Administration does. They actually do what's called a market basket survey, where they go to grocery stores and buy products out of the stores, and then they look in those products for toxicants. There are significant levels of cadmium found in the American diet. And you can see here in everything from beef liver to roasted sunflower seeds, which, by the way, do bioconcentrate cadmium from the soil, and they are a significant source of cadmium, that we do get cadmium in our diet. The other place we get cadmium is from shellfish, what are commonly called bivalve mollusks, otherwise known as clams, and crustaceans, otherwise known as shrimp and lobster. They are filter feeders, so they accumulate metals from aquatic environments because they take in and spit out a lot of debris on the ocean floor. Oysters have as much as 27 milligrams per kilogram weight. And people who eat a lot of oysters can get as much as 174 micrograms per week of cadmium. Studies looking at women who eat shellfish just once a week, that doubles their dietary cadmium intake. So that's another place where we get a significant amount of cadmium. Now, how does cadmium get into chocolate? Well, cadmium gets into a lot of foods that we eat because it is used not only in the United States, but in other countries, which I'll go into when I talk about chocolate growing countries, cocoa growing countries. We use a lot of what is commonly known as biosludge or sewage sludge as a fertilizer. We also use a lot of mine tailings as fertilizer. Now, this is common practice, has been done in the United States and many other countries for decades. And unfortunately, that fertilizer can be contaminated with significant amounts of cadmium because cadmium is inherently part of industrial processes, mine tailings, and unfortunately also human sewage, which is why they call it sewage sludge. So we can see lots of cadmium in sewage sludge and lots of cadmium in mine tailings. And there are certain plants that are very good at taking up and bioconcentrating cadmium from the soil, and cocoa are one of those plants that will bioconcentrate cadmium. That's why it's a concern and a problem, and that's why Consumer Reports was specifically looking for it and finding it as well. Now, here's the rub. There are currently no federal regulations in the United States, and none that I can find in Nigeria, where most of our cocoa comes from, regarding levels of metals in agricultural fertilizer. There were some regulations in the state of Washington and in the state of California as a result of consumer activism, but as far as I can find, they no longer exist. Somehow they have been disappeared. So we do not have in this country and many other countries, probably outside of the European Union, any regulations for what is in the agricultural fertilizer that is used in much of our conventional agriculture. Unfortunately, lead also gets into our food as a result of both legacy lead. Legacy lead is a term that refers to lead that has been circulating around the globe and precipitating down from the skies into the earth and into the soil for a very long time. Remember that we only took lead out of gasoline very, very recently. Lead is still in small aircraft and still in some farm machinery. Lead is still in the gasoline that fuels both small aircraft, some boats, and agricultural machinery at much, much, much lower levels than when it was in gasoline used for cars, but still, and there is lead allowed still in some paint that's used outside of buildings for bridges and things. So we've got this legacy lead that's been in the soil, doesn't break down easily, and the Johns Hopkins researchers just published last year in 2021 an amazing study looking at the amount of lead in urban gardens and comparing that to conventionally grown vegetables that are organically grown, so what you get in the store, and also comparing that to the World Health Organization guidelines for allowable, their suggested allowable levels of lead in produce. And you can see here that the little dark blue urban garden, could be organic, could not be, they didn't differentiate. The urban garden vegetables, many of them are above the World Health Organization limits for lead. Specifically beets, carrots, potatoes, and sweet potatoes, as well as beans, eggplant, pepper, and tomato, but not so much. The big lead uptake plants appear to be beets, carrots, potatoes, and sweet potatoes. And you can see that even organic produce, there was even elevated levels of lead in organic produce, because you don't have to certify the soil as metal-free in order to get organic certification for your crops. So lead is just in the soil. Lead is in the soil in cocoa-growing countries, specifically in Nigeria, where most of the research, and I'm actually going to go through a study, was done in Nigeria. Most of the research looking at lead contamination in cocoa comes from Nigeria. Leaded gasoline is still legal in Nigeria, and much of the gasoline that's used is leaded. They also have a huge amount of legacy lead, so lead from previous uses of leaded gasoline and leaded paint that then becomes part of the atmosphere and recirculates. It precipitates down from the sky and it ends up in the soil. So unfortunately, the soil comes preloaded. So when you grow a cocoa plant in Nigeria, lead is taken up from the soil. This is a study that was done in 2005 published in Environmental Health Perspectives, a great journal on environmental health and medicine. And what you can see here, and here's the mystery of it all, is that cocoa beans have extremely low levels of lead. The shells of the cocoa beans have extremely high levels of lead. And manufactured cocoa, after it's gone through all the processing, is where you get the most lead, of just about 200 nanograms per gram. So the authors of the study looked at the average concentration of lead in a finished manufactured cocoa product. You can see it there on the bar graph. It's about 197 nanograms per gram. Study researchers who were looking at this mystery of why there's actually so little lead in the cocoa bean and so much lead in the finished product said, they were actually looking at the lead isotopes so they could match the lead in the cocoa bean to the lead in the soil and the lead in the finished cocoa product. It did indicate that there were some other sources of contamination that were occurring after the cocoa bean was, it's put out in the sun, it's dried, it's fermented. There could be some lead as a result of just dust contaminating it. They did look at that, and they still found that the difference between the cocoa bean and the cocoa finished product was significant. And you can see that in the graph. I'll go back to it. So cocoa beans, you've got about 1 nanogram per gram, if even that. The manufactured cocoa, you've got 197 nanograms per gram, so almost 200 times. So what they said basically is this is a mystery that needs to be solved. Somewhere along the production line, there's lead contamination. And as far as I know, that has not been isolated. Now, maybe as a result of this Consumer Reports narrative that we're getting, there will be an incentive for looking into it. So, bottom line, what are the safer choices that were determined by this Consumer Reports study? Mast, M-A-S-T, organic dark chocolate, had only 14% of the Prop 65 lead levels and only 40% of the cadmium Prop 65 lead levels. You can see here that it is literally impossible to find chocolate that has no cadmium in it. So what's the bottom line here? Well, as I mentioned before, the FDA is in the process of putting forth what's called an interim reference level. That just means new advice on how much lead children and adults can get in their diets, and that would include water, that basically is below a level that would be problematic. So, according to blood levels of lead, for a child, we know that anything above 3.5 micrograms per deciliter in the blood of a child is not safe. There's actually good evidence for learning disabilities and potentially negative effects on IQ at levels as low as 1 microgram per deciliter. But for as far as Medicare, Medicaid, and the federal government's concerned, anything less than 3.5 mics per deciliter in a child is okay. For a woman of childbearing age, anything above 5 is too much. So anything above 5.0 microgram per deciliter is too much. How much lead can you eat and stay below that safe, that upper limit of safety for lead in your blood? Well, for a kid, it's 2.2 micrograms per day. And you already saw that there are levels in chocolate that actually exceed that for an ounce of intake. For women of childbearing age, it's more. It's 8.8 microgram per day. So you'd have to eat quite a bit of chocolate, but it is absolutely possible to go above that. And therefore, over time, if you did that every day for several months, your blood level as a result would be above 5 microgram per deciliter. So we're talking about very low levels of exposure from lead to stay in that safe blood lead level reference range. And what about cadmium? Well, as I mentioned, there is a federal minimum risk level for cadmium. For an adult, it maxes out at 7 micrograms per day. And as you saw from the Swedish literature and from the World Health Organization, we are exposed to much, much more. So yeah, cadmium and lead are carcinogens. They are reproductive toxicants. Cadmium has serious damaging capacity in kidney function and increases risk for osteoporosis. Lead will increase risk for food allergies in children. It is a reproductive toxicant causing low birth weight in children, and it is highly related to risk for cardiovascular disease, death from stroke, and heart attack. So we don't want these metals in our diet. So I hope this has been helpful to explain the Consumer Reports data and how to find some chocolate that is safe. I don't really have any problem recommending the safe chocolates that Consumer Reports recommends. We do get cadmium and lead in very small amounts in our diet in other places, and so I think the small amounts that they found in the safe chocolate are not going to be a problem as long as you don't eat 16 ounces of chocolate every day, which hopefully you can keep it below a pound of chocolate a day, keep it down to an ounce or two. So I hope this has been helpful. We do have a monthly podcast specifically for healthcare providers, the EMEI review. There's a link here that you can access. We've been doing these podcasts for several years, and so you get a whole library of monthly podcasts on topics like mercury toxicity and plastic pollution and things that are now really impossible to practice medicine without knowing. Have a good new year and enjoy your well-chosen chocolate.